the city of Ravencross stood silent under the oppressive weight of an impending storm. Its once proud towers, now tarnished and broken, loomed against the darkened sky, casting long shadows over the broken streets below. The wind howled through the alleyways, carrying with it the faint scent of rain and iron. Lord Kaelen stood at the edge of the tower, his dark cloak billowing in the wind. His piercing eyes were fixed on the horizon, where a storm was gathering, not in the heavens, but within him. "They've taken everything," he muttered, his voice low and filled with a bitterness that seemed to cut through the cold air. "But they will not take me." Behind him, the faint sound of footsteps reached his ears, but he didn't turn around. His mind was already plotting the path to vengeance, a path that would burn everything in its way. "Prepare the men," Kaelen said, his tone now firm and cold. "We begin the reckoning at dawn." The War Council was grim. Inside the stone-walled chamber, the air was thick with smoke from the torchlight. Kaelen stood at the head of the table, his gaze unwavering as he looked at the scattered maps of Ravencross and the surrounding territories. The table was cluttered with the remnants of previous battles, broken swords, torn banners, and scattered scrolls. His generals stood around him, waiting for their next orders. "The time for defense has passed," Kaelen said, his voice cold and resolute. "We strike first." One of his captains, a grizzled veteran named Valen, spoke up. "But we are outnumbered. We can't fight this war alone." Kaelen's eyes darkened. "We will have no choice but to fight. If we do not, Ravencross will fall, and so will our last hope." Silence followed, the weight of his words settling over the room. "Prepare the forces," Kaelen said sharply, "and gather every last weapon we have. We fight at dawn." The night before the battle was eerily still. Outside, the storm continued to rage, but inside the war room, there was a sense of quiet determination. Kaelen sat alone, staring at the fire crackling in the hearth. His thoughts were a whirlwind, memories of lost comrades, the city's fall, and the choices that had brought him here. Suddenly, a knock at the door broke his reverie. Anna, his most trusted lieutenant, entered silently. "The men are ready," she said, her voice calm but steady. "We fight tomorrow." Kaelen stood and turned to face her. "Tomorrow we end this," he said, his voice resolute. Anna nodded and stepped closer. "We will, my lord. But you know that victory comes at a cost." Kaelen's gaze softened for a moment. "I know, but I will see Ravencross rise again, or I will burn it to the ground." With that, Anna bowed and left, and Kaelen remained, alone in the flickering shadows, preparing for the coming storm. Dawn broke with a red sky, a harbinger of the bloodshed to come. Kaelen stood on the battlements, watching as his forces gathered in the city's center. The men were battle-worn, weary from the long siege, but their eyes burned with the same determination that Kaelen felt in his own chest. "Today, we reclaim what is ours," he said, turning to face them. His voice carried over the assembled soldiers, and a murmur of agreement rippled through the ranks. Anna approached from behind, her face hardened. "We move now," she said, her hand resting on the hilt of her sword. Kaelen nodded, his resolve solidified. "We march for Ravencross and we take it back, no matter the cost." The soldiers, their faces grim yet resolute, raised their weapons in unison, ready for the final push. The battle for Ravencross had begun. The clash of metal rang through the air as Kaelen led the charge, his sword flashing in the dim light. The enemy, though outnumbered, fought fiercely, but Kaelen's fury was unstoppable. He cut through them with precision, each strike carrying the weight of his years of preparation. Behind him, Anna moved like a shadow, her blades slicing through enemy ranks with deadly accuracy. As they fought, Kaelen's mind raced, calculating each move, anticipating the enemy's next strike. But even as they pressed forward, the enemy's numbers seemed endless. "We will break them," Kaelen shouted, rallying his men. The tide of battle was shifting, but it was far from over. He could feel the weight of Ravencross's future resting on his shoulders, and he refused to fail. The sun had barely risen over Ravencross, casting a pale light over the battlefield. Kaelen stood at the city's edge, his sword now sheathed at his side. The air was thick with the aftermath of war, the cries of the wounded, the stench of blood and smoke, and the quiet chatter of soldiers tending to their injured. Though they had taken the enemy by surprise, the victory felt bittersweet. "This victory has come at a heavy cost," Kaelen muttered, his gaze sweeping over the battlefield. Beside him, Anna approached, her expression grim. "We've lost too many men. The cost may be too high to recover from." Kaelen turned to her, his face hardened by resolve. "We don't have a choice. Ravencross will rise again, no matter what it takes." Anna nodded, though doubt lingered in her eyes. "And what of the enemy forces still out there?" she asked, her voice soft but filled with urgency. Kaelen clenched his jaw. "We hunt them down, Anna. We finish this." The War Council had gathered once more. Inside the dimly lit chamber, the heavy weight of the last battle lingered in the air. The men and women around the table were battle-worn, their faces lined with exhaustion. Kaelen stood at the head of the table, staring down at the maps of the surrounding territories. "The enemy will regroup," he said, his voice hard like steel. "We must strike them before they have the chance." Valen, the grizzled veteran, spoke up. "We can't push too far. Our forces are stretched thin. If we leave the city undefended, Ravencross will be exposed." Kaelen's eyes narrowed. "Then we fortify. But we move quickly. We can't afford to wait." Anna, who had been silent until now, placed a hand on the table. "Kaelen, we can't sustain this forever. There are too many enemies, and too few of us." Kaelen's gaze hardened as he looked at her. "Then we make them regret underestimating us." The days passed in a blur of preparation and planning. The soldiers of Ravencross fortified the walls, and trained relentlessly, knowing the next battle could come at any moment. Kaelen spent his nights in the war room, his eyes red from lack of sleep, his mind consumed by strategy. "We have no time to waste," he muttered to himself, tracing his finger across the maps. Suddenly, Anna entered, her footsteps quiet but firm. "You've been at this for days, Kaelen. You need rest." Kaelen looked up, his eyes meeting hers, his expression cold but appreciative. "Rest will come after the war is won, Anna." Anna stepped closer, her voice softening. "And if the cost is too much to bear?" she asked. Kaelen hesitated, his gaze drifting to the window where the storm clouds still lingered. "Then we bear it. We do what's necessary." Anna gave him a long look, then turned and left, her footsteps echoing through the empty halls. Kaelen remained alone in the silence, the weight of his choices pressing down on him. The evening before the next battle, the tension in the air was almost unbearable. The soldiers gathered in the courtyard, preparing their weapons and armor. Kaelen stood at the front, his eyes scanning the horizon where the first signs of the enemy's army were visible. The ground trembled with the march of countless soldiers. Anna approached, her armor now worn and battle-ready. "Are you ready for this?" she asked, her voice steady, but filled with a quiet concern. Kaelen turned to her, his expression resolute. "Ravencross is ready. We fight for our future, Anna, for our home." She nodded, her gaze unwavering. "And if we fall?" she asked, her voice soft but determined. Kaelen paused, the weight of her question hanging in the air. "Then we die as warriors. But we will not fall. Not today." The sound of marching grew louder, and Kaelen drew his sword, his eyes hardening. "It begins now." The battle for Ravencross was a brutal, unrelenting struggle. The sounds of clashing metal, the cries of soldiers, and the thundering of hooves filled the air. Kaelen fought at the forefront, his sword cutting down enemies with precise, calculated strikes. Anna was by his side, her twin blades flashing as she carved a path through the chaos. The battlefield was a blur of violence and destruction, but Kaelen remained focused. "We can't hold them forever," shouted Valen, his voice hoarse. "We need to break through their lines." Kaelen nodded, his jaw clenched. "We will not retreat," he said through gritted teeth. "Push forward. We take the heart of their army, and we end this." The soldiers around him roared in agreement, their spirits lifted by Kaelen's command. The fight raged on, but the tide was slowly turning in their favor. Ravencross had not yet fallen, and Kaelen refused to let it. The storm had passed, but the aftermath was just as devastating. The battlefield was strewn with the remains of both the defenders and the invaders, a grim reminder of the fierce battle that had taken place. Kaelen walked through the remnants of the battlefield, his footsteps heavy on the blood-soaked earth. His armor was battered, his sword still dripping with the blood of enemies and comrades alike. The smell of death hung in the air, and the cries of the wounded filled the silence. Anna approached him, her face smeared with dirt and blood, but her eyes remained resolute. "We've won, Kaelen," she said quietly. "But at what cost?" Kaelen paused, his gaze distant. "Victory always comes at a price," he replied, his voice tinged with both resolve and sorrow. "But Ravencross lives, and that's what matters." Anna's gaze softened, but she remained silent, knowing that the cost of this war was far from over. In the war room, the mood was heavy. Kaelen stood at the head of the table, staring down at the new map spread before him. His forces had been decimated, but the enemy had taken just as many losses. His generals were gathered around, their faces drawn with exhaustion, but none dared to speak of surrender. "We've pushed them back," Valen said, his voice weary. "But they will return with reinforcements. We need to fortify Ravencross before they strike again." Kaelen's eyes flickered to Anna, who stood near the door, her expression unreadable. "We don't have the time for reinforcements," Kaelen said, his voice firm. "We strike first. We take the fight to them. We end this now." There was a moment of silence, and then Anna stepped forward, her voice quiet but filled with resolve. "Then we fight as we have before. No retreat, no surrender." The day before the next battle, Kaelen stood on the walls of Ravencross, staring out over the city and the wilderness beyond. The weight of his decisions hung heavily on him. With every battle, they came closer to victory, but also to the edge of destruction. Anna appeared beside him, her expression just as hard as his. "You know they won't give up," she said, her voice low. "They'll fight until the last of us is dead." Kaelen nodded, his gaze still fixed on the horizon. "I know, but we don't have a choice. We fight until we can't anymore." Anna stood beside him in silence for a moment. Then she spoke again, her voice softer. "Do you think there will be anything left to rebuild once it's over?" Kaelen's gaze flickered toward her, and for a moment he was silent. "There will be," he said finally. "But if there's not, then we'll rebuild it ourselves, piece by piece." Anna gave him a small nod, and together they stood in the quiet, watching the storm clouds gathering once again. The final battle was upon them. The ground shook with the sound of the enemy's approach, their forces moving in an organized wave toward Ravencross. Kaelen stood at the front of his troops, his sword drawn and his eyes steely with determination. "This is it," he said, his voice carrying across the ranks of his soldiers. "We stand here or we fall, but we do not run. We fight for our city, for our home. We fight for the people who can't fight for themselves, and we will win." A roar went up from the soldiers, a wave of energy surging through them as they rallied to Kaelen's call. Behind him, Anna moved into position, her blades ready, her gaze locked on the approaching enemy. "We end this today," Kaelen said, his voice resolute. "No matter the cost." The battle raged on, the clash of metal and the cries of the wounded filling the air. Kaelen fought at the front, his movements sharp and precise, his sword cutting through the enemy ranks with relentless fury. Anna fought beside him, her blades flashing as she struck down one opponent after another. But even as they made progress, the enemy's numbers seemed endless. Kaelen could feel his strength waning, but his resolve remained unbroken. "We hold this line!" he shouted, his voice carrying above the din of battle. Valen, who had been fighting nearby, nodded and shouted back, "We'll hold, my lord." The tide of the battle was shifting. Slowly but surely, Ravencross defenders began to push the enemy back. But Kaelen knew that victory came at a steep price. As the last of the enemy forces retreated, Kaelen stood among the bloodied battlefield, the cost of their victory evident in the wounded and fallen soldiers around him. "We've won," he said quietly. "But at what cost?" Ravencross had been won, but the victory was not without its toll. Kaelen sat in the war room, his eyes fixed on the maps before him. but his mind was elsewhere. The weight of leadership pressed heavily on him. Anna entered the room, her steps echoing against the stone floor. "You've been at this for hours," she said quietly. "You need rest." Kaelen didn't look up. "Rest will come when this is over. We need to prepare for what comes next." Anna moved closer, her expression softening. "You've done more than enough. The men look to you for strength. Don't let the weight of it crush you." Kaelen finally looked up, his gaze meeting hers. "I didn't ask for this responsibility. I didn't ask for this war. But Ravencross is still standing because we fought for it." Anna nodded, her gaze unwavering. "And we'll continue to fight, for as long as it takes." Kaelen stood, his voice low but firm. "Then we plan. We rebuild what we've lost. And we ensure no one ever threatens this city again." The night was quiet, but the city was restless. As Kaelen walked through the streets, he saw the survivors of the battle, men and women working to rebuild the walls, heal the wounded, and mourn the fallen. It was a slow process, but the spirit of Ravencross remained unbroken. Anna was at the front of one of the rebuilding efforts, directing the soldiers as they reinforced the outer walls. She caught sight of Kaelen as he approached, and nodded in greeting. "The repairs are coming along well," she said. Kaelen glanced around, his gaze lingering on the faces of the people who had fought so hard to defend their home. "They're strong," he said quietly. "But they're also tired. We need to prepare for what's next." Anna gave a grim smile. "The people of Ravencross are used to fighting. They will not falter, not now." Kaelen looked at her, his voice low. "I hope you're right." And with that, they turned toward the horizon, knowing that the next threat could be just over the ridge. The next day, Kaelen stood atop the city walls, surveying the horizon. The storm that had passed days earlier seemed to have lingered in the air, leaving a sense of foreboding in its wake. Anna approached, her footsteps light but steady. "The scouts report nothing out of the ordinary, my lord," she said, her voice steady. "No new enemy movements." Kaelen nodded, but his expression remained tense. "The calm before the storm," he muttered. "We've won a battle, but the war is far from over. They won't let us have peace." Anna looked out over the city, the remnants of the battle still visible in the distance. "Then we continue to prepare. We don't let our guard down." Kaelen turned to her, his eyes hard. "We won't. We fight until Ravencross is safe, or we die trying." Anna placed a hand on his shoulder. "And we'll make sure it's not the second option." Days passed without any sign of the enemy. Ravencross had begun its slow recovery, the people rebuilding their homes and the soldiers strengthening their defenses. But Kaelen could feel the tension building. The enemy might not attack right away, but they were out there somewhere, waiting. One evening, as Kaelen sat in the war room, going over the latest intelligence reports, Valen entered the room, his face grave. "We found something, my lord," Valen said. "A group of enemy scouts has been spotted just beyond the forest to the north. They're watching us." Kaelen stood up, his face hardening. "It's a warning. They're regrouping. We can't afford to ignore it." Valen nodded. "What are your orders?" Kaelen paused, his mind racing. "We take the initiative. We strike first, before they can gather their full force." Anna, who had been standing in the corner, spoke up. "We hit them hard and fast. They won't see us coming." The time to act had come. As Kaelen and his forces moved out to engage the enemy scouts, the weight of the decision hung heavily on his mind. He knew that this battle, though small, could have far-reaching consequences. They had to strike hard before the enemy could gather their full strength. As they approached the forest's edge, Kaelen signaled for his men to stop. The air was thick with anticipation. "We move in silence," Kaelen said quietly. "Get in, hit them hard, and get out. No time for mistakes." The soldiers nodded, and Kaelen led them into the trees, their movements swift and deadly. The enemy scouts, unaware of their approach, were caught off guard as Ravencross's soldiers descended upon them. Within moments the battle was over, and the enemy scouts lay dead or captured. Kaelen surveyed the aftermath, his eyes scanning the area. "This is just the beginning," he said, his voice low. "We have sent a message, and now we wait for their response." The morning after the successful ambush, Kaelen stood once again on the walls of Ravencross, looking out over the city. The sun was rising, but its light felt hollow, like the calm before the next storm. Despite the victory over the scouts, he knew the enemy would be back with a vengeance. His soldiers had dealt a blow, but it was only a small fraction of what was coming. Anna joined him at the edge of the wall, her face still weary from the previous night's battle. "You think they'll retaliate?" she asked, her voice low. Kaelen nodded, his eyes scanning the horizon. "Without a doubt, they won't let this insult go unanswered." Anna looked over at him, her expression hardening. "Then we make sure they regret it." Kaelen glanced at her, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "We will, but we have to be ready. The next battle will be the one that decides everything." Anna met his gaze, her resolve matching his. "Then we fight until the end." The War Council had gathered once again. The room was filled with the same familiar faces, his generals, his advisors, and Anna, who had become his most trusted lieutenant. Kaelen stood at the head of the table, his hands resting on the map that covered the surface. "The enemy is regrouping," he said, his voice steady but filled with determination. "They will be here soon, and we cannot afford to wait. We must strike before they can get their forces together." Kaelen, ever cautious, raised an eyebrow. "My lord, we are still rebuilding. Our forces are not at full strength." Kaelen turned to him, his eyes unwavering. "Then we fight with what we have. If we wait, we lose. If we fight, we have a chance." There was a moment of silence, and then Anna spoke. "Kaelen's right. If we strike hard and fast, we can break their lines before they regroup." The generals nodded, their faces set in determination. "We fight then," Kaelen said firmly. At dawn, the morning of the battle arrived, and the city of Ravencross stirred with activity. Soldiers gathered in the courtyards, readying their weapons and armor, their faces a mixture of determination and fear. Kaelen stood at the front of the formation, his sword drawn, his posture commanding. "This is the moment," he said to his men. "We fight for Ravencross, for everything we've built. And we fight to win." The soldiers responded with a unified roar, their spirits lifted by Kaelen's words. Anna, standing beside him, gave him a brief nod. "We hold the line," she said, her voice steady. "We fight until the end." Kaelen's eyes met hers, and for a moment, there was an unspoken understanding between them. "We will hold," he said quietly, his gaze turning back to the horizon. The enemy was coming, and this time, Ravencross would not fall. The battle began with a deafening roar. Kaelen's forces clashed with the enemy in a violent wave of steel and blood. The ground beneath them seemed to shake with each strike, and the air was filled with the sounds of battle. The clash of swords, the cries of the wounded, and the commands of generals. Kaelen fought at the front, cutting down enemy soldiers with cold precision. His mind was focused, each strike a calculated move, each decision made in the heat of battle. Anna moved beside him, her twin blades flashing, as she carved a path through the enemy ranks. "We push them back," Kaelen shouted, his voice carrying over the chaos. Valen, leading the flank, shouted in response, "We will." But despite their efforts, the enemy was relentless. Their numbers were overwhelming, and with every soldier that fell, the pressure grew. But Kaelen would not retreat. Not now. "For Ravencross," he bellowed, rallying his men to push forward. The battle reached its peak, and Kaelen could feel the tide of the conflict shifting. His forces were exhausted, their numbers thinning, but they fought on with the desperation of men who had nothing left to lose. "We can't hold much longer," Valen shouted, his voice strained. Kaelen's gaze was sharp as he looked around the battlefield. The enemy was weakening, but they were still pressing forward. "We push forward or we die here," he shouted, rallying his men one last time. With a roar, his soldiers surged forward, and the enemy faltered. The momentum shifted, and slowly, the enemy began to retreat. Kaelen could feel his heart pounding in his chest as the sound of retreating footsteps filled the air. The battle was won, but at what cost? Kaelen surveyed the battlefield, his face grim. Ravencross had survived, but it had been a close call. "We've won," he muttered to himself. "But it's not over. Not yet." Ravencross was quiet now. The battle had ended, and the city was beginning to heal, but the victory felt hollow. Kaelen stood in the center of the city, his gaze distant as he watched his people rebuild. The sounds of construction filled the air, men hammering, women tending to the wounded, children playing in the rubble. But there was no joy in Kaelen's heart. Victory had come at a price. The dead still lay unburied, their bodies scattered across the battlefield. The wounded were many, and the city was fractured, its once proud walls now scarred. "This city has seen too much bloodshed," Anna said, her voice breaking through his thoughts. She stood beside him, her face as weary as his. "We fought to protect it. But what do we protect now?" Kaelen's gaze softened for a moment, as he looked at her. "We protect what remains, what's worth saving." His voice was steady, though his heart felt heavy with the weight of what they had lost. The War Council convened again, but this time the atmosphere was different. The weight of their decisions hung over them as Kaelen addressed his generals. "And wait. The enemy is not defeated," he said, his voice steady but tinged with exhaustion. "They will regroup, and they will return. We cannot rest yet." Valen, ever the pragmatist, spoke up. "But our forces are depleted, my lord. We can't keep fighting at this pace." Kaelen's eyes hardened. "We fight because we have no choice. We've pushed them back, but they will be back for more. This is not over until they are completely eradicated." Anna stood beside him, her expression filled with determination. "We must gather every last soldier we can find, prepare our defenses, and strike once more. Ravencross will survive this, if we make it so." The generals nodded, their resolve firming in the face of the unrelenting enemy. Kaelen's forces began to prepare for the next strike. The sounds of training and weapon sharpening filled the air as soldiers drilled in the courtyards. Kaelen moved among them, offering words of encouragement to the weary but determined fighters. His mind was focused, every decision carefully calculated. "We cannot afford to lose momentum," he said to Anna as they walked together. "The enemy is regrouping, but they are not invincible. We will crush them before they can form their strength again." Anna nodded, her expression grim. "But even with all this preparation, there is still much we don't know about their numbers. We could be walking into a trap." Kaelen's face softened for a moment. "We'll take the risk. Ravencross has already bled enough. We fight until there's nothing left to fight for." Anna met his gaze, a quiet understanding passing between them. "Then we fight with everything we have." The day before the battle, the air was thick with tension. Kaelen stood atop the walls of Ravencross once again, his gaze fixed on the horizon. The sky was dark, and the first hints of a storm were visible in the distance. The enemy was closer than they had ever been. Anna stood beside him, her arms crossed, as she too looked out at the approaching threat. "Do you think this will be the final battle?" she asked quietly. Kaelen turned to her, his eyes unwavering. "It has to be. We can't keep living like this, always waiting for the next attack. Ravencross needs to be safe. Once and for all." Anna nodded, though doubt flickered in her eyes. "And if we fail?" Kaelen's gaze softened for a moment. "Then Ravencross falls, but we will fight until our last breath." There was a long pause before Anna spoke again, her voice firm. "Then we die fighting, together." The battle began with a roar, as the enemy forces finally arrived at the gates of Ravencross. Kaelen stood at the front of his army, his sword raised high. "For Ravencross," he shouted, his voice carrying across the battlefield. The soldiers responded in unison, their voices rising with determination. The ground shook as the enemy charged, their numbers vast, but Kaelen's forces were ready. Anna fought beside him, her twin blades flashing as she struck down enemy soldiers. "Hello." The clash of metal echoed across the battlefield, and Kaelen's mind was consumed with strategy. Every move was calculated, every strike a deliberate decision. The enemy pushed forward, but Kaelen's forces held the line. "We will not fall," Kaelen shouted, his voice filled with fury. We fight to the last. And with that, the battle raged on, with the fate of Ravencross hanging in the balance. The final battle was upon them. Ravencross soldiers, battered and bloodied, stood their ground as the enemy's forces poured over the hilltops, their numbers seemingly endless. Kaelen stood at the head of his army, his sword gleaming in the pale morning light. "We stand here or we die here," he said, his voice low but filled with resolve. The soldiers around him nodded, their expressions steely with determination. Anna, standing beside him, tightened her grip on her blades. "No retreat, Kaelen," she said firmly. "Not this time." Kaelen's eyes met hers, and for a moment the world seemed to fall away. There was no doubt, no fear in that moment, only the certainty that this was their final chance. "For Ravencross," Kaelen said, his voice echoing through the ranks. "We fight until there is nothing left to fight for." The army responded in a roar of agreement, and with a thunderous cry, they surged forward, ready to face the storm head-on. The battle raged with brutal intensity. Kaelen fought at the front, his sword cutting down enemies with lethal precision. Every strike, every move, was a reflection of the countless hours of training and sacrifice. Anna fought beside him, her blades flashing as she moved with the agility of a predator, striking down enemies in swift, calculated motions. "We cannot falter now," Kaelen shouted, his voice cutting through the chaos. "We must push forward." The enemy's forces pressed on, their numbers seemingly endless, but Kaelen's soldiers were relentless. Valen, leading a charge from the left flank, called out, "We break their lines, now!" With that, Kaelen's forces surged forward, breaking through the enemy's front lines and pushing them back. But even as the enemy began to retreat, Kaelen knew the fight was far from over. The cost would be high, but Ravencross would not fall, not on his watch. As the battle wore on, Kaelen's forces began to gain ground, but the enemy was far from defeated. They fought with desperation, unwilling to concede defeat. "We cannot let them regroup," Kaelen shouted, his voice hoarse from the exertion. Anna, her face smeared with blood and dirt, glanced at him. "We keep pushing," she said. "There's no stopping now." Kaelen nodded, his gaze locked onto the enemy's commander who had rallied his troops at the rear. "We take their leader," Kaelen said. "If we break their command, the rest will fall." With that, Kaelen and Anna led a small but determined charge toward the enemy's command. The enemy forces tried to stop them, but Kaelen's soldiers followed him with unwavering determination. As they neared the enemy's leader, Kaelen's sword struck down the first line of defense, and the battle grew ever closer to its conclusion. The enemy's leader stood tall, his soldiers protecting him with everything they had left. But Kaelen was relentless. With a roar, he pushed forward, cutting through the remaining defenders. The battle around him seemed to blur as he focused solely on the man who had caused so much pain to his people. "This ends now," Kaelen muttered, his sword raised high as he approached the enemy commander. The two men locked eyes, and for a brief moment, everything stopped. The enemy commander raised his own sword, and the two charged toward each other, their weapons clashing with a deafening sound. The battle raged around them, but in that moment, there was only the clash of steel and the fire in Kaelen's heart. "For Ravencross," Kaelen shouted, driving his sword into the enemy commander's chest. The commander's eyes widened in shock, but before he could respond, he fell to the ground, lifeless. The enemy's forces faltered, and the battle began to turn in Kaelen's favor. The enemy's forces, now leaderless and broken, began to retreat. The remaining soldiers fled into the wilderness, their morale shattered by the fall of their commander. Kaelen stood on the battlefield, his sword still drawn, his breath heavy. His soldiers cheered, their victory hard-earned and filled with sacrifice. But Kaelen's gaze was distant, the weight of the battle still pressing on him. Anna approached, her blade stained with blood, but her expression filled with relief. "We did it," she said softly. Kaelen looked at her, his eyes tired but resolute. "We won, but at what cost?" he asked. Anna's gaze softened. "Ravencross stands. That's what matters." Kaelen nodded, but his mind was already focused on the future. Ravencross stands, he repeated, but we must rebuild. The fight isn't over. He turned away, walking toward the city's gates, ready to lead his people into the next chapter of their struggle. Ravencross would rise again, no matter the cost.